Welcome, everyone. Rabbi Laura Duhan-Kaplan here to speak with you about an important skill for theological scholars, the skill of argumentation. In ordinary English, an argument is an angry dispute. Two people who clearly do not think in the same way talk past each other, sometimes in heated, angry ways. But in academic English, an argument has the exact opposite meaning. A scholarly argument is a logical presentation of information. It is an invitation to your readers and to your listeners to think along with you, step by careful step, to your conclusion. As best we know, the practice of scholarly argumentation comes from the ancient Greek philosophical tradition. Greek philosophy influenced Jewish, Christian, Islamic, Hindu, and Buddhist philosophers, and it set the tone for all academic research today. Argumentation is not the only way of presenting information. It is, for example, different from the arts and different from indigenous storytelling traditions. And I will give an example at the end of how storytelling can become part of a scholarly argument. Making an argument invites your listeners to think along with you in a fairly linear way, which usually means it's not the same as sharing your creative process. We all use creative processes in our research. We all have our own ways of gathering information, our own ways of sorting through it, and these processes are rarely linear. If you share all the details, you actually distract people from your conclusion. You might be a person who reads and takes lots of notes on lots of pieces of paper. And then maybe you sort the papers by theme and by topic, and gradually a pattern of ideas emerges. Or maybe you conduct interviews. You interview many people. You take notes. You sort and resort the notes until you see a pattern. And you could tell us, your readers, your listeners, about all of the ideas and how the theme gradually emerged from your web of thought. But this would probably stimulate us to think in many different directions about the topic. And most of them would not be the direction you want us to go in. This would be a great way to start a free-ranging brainstorming discussion, but not a great way to craft a step-by-step scholarly argument. You might be someone very aware of your nighttime dreams. Maybe you read right before bed. And as you put your book down, you think of a question and you ask for a dream that answers it. You're rewarded with a dream. You wake up in the middle of the night. You scribble a bunch of notes in your journal in the dark. And in the morning, you wake up. You decipher your handwriting. You reconstruct the dream. You analyze it in 3 different ways, and you decide which one of them helps you answer your research question. And you could tell us, your audience, your readers, about your dream images, your 3 analyses, and how finally one of them led to your conclusion. And this would definitely stimulate us to think and talk about our own dreams. And it would probably stimulate us to offer alternative interpretations of your dream, however annoying you might find that to be. And this would be a great way to inspire our creativity, but it is probably too much information if you want us to focus on understanding your conclusion. So let's look at what argumentation is, what focused argumentation is, and then a little bit at how to incorporate some of our creative processes into the argument. We'll start with one contemporary model of argumentation articulated by the recently deceased British philosopher Stephen Toulmin. In fact, we'll focus on this argument form. We won't use Toulmin's technical terms, but we will use an adapted version of his 5-step model. We'll talk about the thesis statement, the evidence, the connection, the justification, and the responses to objection. Let's start with a simple example. Let's say you want to invite Bob to a study gathering where you'll be providing the drinks. You don't know Bob well, and you want to make sure there's something he likes to drink. So you ask another friend, a mutual friend, what Bob likes, and your friend says, Bob likes to drink milk. That's the thesis. But you're a little anxious, you want to get it right, you want to make sure your friend's information is accurate. So you ask her, how do you know that Bob likes milk? And she says, I saw him buy it yesterday at the grocery store. But you're still a little bit unsure about how that evidence supports the thesis. And you give your friend a quizzical look, and she continues. She finishes her thought. People usually buy what they like to eat and drink. Unfortunately, this seems counterintuitive to you because you buy lots of things that you don't like for other members of your household. And you say this to your friend, so she gives you a bit more information. She says, Bob is a loner. He lives by himself. He rarely has friends over. And you know, people who live alone often get set in their ways. And once they discover what they like, they buy it over and over again. That's the justification that explains why the connection your friend made is a reasonable one. Okay, you are convinced, but your friend has seen how skeptical you are. And she adds an answer to one more question that you haven't even asked. She says, I'm positive Bob is not using the milk for a science experiment because Bob is very frugal, very thrifty, very careful with his money, very environmentally conscious, and he would never buy food he wouldn't eat. Let's look at this example a little bit more deeply to highlight a few points about using argumentation well. When you formulate a thesis statement, you want it to be specific. Bob likes milk is relatively specific. You can offer the evidence that you actually saw Bob buy milk. You do not want to claim that Bob likes dairy. You don't have evidence for that, and you'd have to do a lot more research. You'd have to stalk Bob and follow him to the grocery store week after week until you'd seen him buy milk and cheese and ice cream and butter and yogurt. And if you're writing a paper about Bob and his love of milk, and you start to realize that you have set yourself up to do an impossible amount of research, you might look again at your thesis statement. If it's too broad for you to support, you want to make it more specific. You also want to be focused when you choose the evidence that you will share. When you have done a lot of research, it is tempting to add it into your argument, but it might not be helpful. For example, you could add a lot of detail about Bob. You could say, I saw Bob buy the milk in the grocery store the other day. It was at the corner market where Bob goes every Wednesday at 6 p.m. He always pays with his debit card, and he brings his groceries home in a black saddlebag on his bicycle. And you know, there's an interesting fact about the brand of milk that Bob bought. It comes from a small local farm, and all of us should buy it. This is all very interesting information about Bob and his personality and his way of life. And of course, it's a good opportunity to promote good ecological ethics and good business ethics, but it doesn't help convince us that Bob likes milk. When you are deep into excitement about your research, you will see connections intuitively. And when you have a lot of background knowledge, things that are actually very complex will seem self-evident to you. You may think that you do not need to articulate the connections that you see. But your audience, your reader, is not inside your head. They have not studied everything you have studied. What is obvious to you will not be obvious to them. So you do have to articulate the connections. It's important always to ask yourself, why do I think this evidence supports my thesis? And it's important to take one more step, to ask yourself, why does the connection seem so self-evident to me? What do I know or believe about this principle of connection that might not be self-evident to others? What do I need to explain about it in order to bring others on board with my thinking and my understanding? Articulating a connection and a justification is probably the most challenging part of scholarly argumentation. It is one of the places of heavy lifting in crafting an argument. If you can get the connection and the justification right, then responding to potential objections is easy because you're already able to step back from your ideas. You're already able to see them from someone else's perspective. You have a sense of what questions someone else might ask, and you have a sense of how you might respond. Now, the example of Bob and his love of milk might have been a silly one. So here is an example of a more theological argument, a very famous one in philosophy of religion. It is an argument for the existence of God. It is called the argument from design. Aquinas offered a version of it in the 13th century, and William Paley in the 18th century offered an updated version of it that is sometimes called the watchmaker's argument. So imagine that you, a believer, are using the watchmaker argument to explain your beliefs to an atheist friend. Here's your thesis. It's very simple. God exists. And your friend asks the obvious question. What is the evidence for God's existence? Why, it's obvious, you say. Just step outside the front door and see how the world ecosystem is complex and delicately balanced. Seriously, your friend responds. Seriously, you think God exists just because the world exists? Why would you think that? And don't tell me because the Bible says so and the Bible is the Word of God, because you know as well as I do that that is just a big circle. So, in response to your friend's question, you explain your thought by offering the connection that you see. Something complex and balanced must have a designer. That's why the complexity of the world seems to you to be evidence for God's existence. Of course, your friend asks, must something complex really have a designer? It couldn't have happened by accident? So you offer more background information to justify your connection, to show that it is a reasonable connection. In this case, you offer an analogy. And you say, complex things like the old-fashioned, non-digital mechanical watches, complex things have human designers. The universe is much greater than a watch, so it must have a really skilled designer who is more than human. And by now, you know that your friend will keep asking questions, and they'll probably ask you the big theological deal breaker question, the nearly unanswerable question about the role of God in the universe. Your friend might say, but the universe is really flawed. It's filled with natural disasters and suffering, things that are terrible for so many creatures, especially humans. Why would you call the world's designer skilled? And perhaps you respond by saying, the designer must have a broader view of reality than human beings do. Because things that seem terrible to us probably do have an importance in the greater biological or geological theme. And the designer sees beyond the human view and understands the importance of natural processes like earthquakes and illness, even if they are upsetting and disruptive to human beings. This has been a very short and very focused version of the argument from design. There's a great deal more you could say. So imagine that you are writing a 50-page master's thesis, offering a 21st century version of the argument from design. Each step in the argument might be an entire chapter. Chapter 1. For your thesis, God exists. You might give a history of the argument from design and explain how it defines the two key words in the thesis, God and existence. Chapter 2. Your evidence. The world ecosystem is balanced. You might write 10 pages on contemporary ecological definitions and descriptions of interdependence. Chapter 3, your connection, your view that complex and balanced things have a designer. You might give 10 pages of ideas from, say, organizational psychology on how well it works when humans intentionally design interdependent systems. For Chapter 4, your justification, your further development and support of the connection. You might offer 10 pages explaining why this is a valid analogy, why and how you can argue from human experience to conclusions about God. Chapter 5, response to objections. You might take 10 pages to offer, say, 2 objections to various steps in the argument, where you carefully answer one objection and note the other as an area for further research. Obviously, this would be a complex and multidisciplinary thesis, but it grows out of a simple argument structure. When you craft an argument, you can use many different kinds of evidence. You can use an analogy, like the argument from design does. You can use a scriptural text. You can use dreams. You can use ancestral stories and cultural myths. You just need to do a really good job of presenting the connection and the justification. Here's an example of arguing using a text as evidence. Your thesis. The biblical author believes that God is more like a mother than like a father. Your evidence? Genesis chapter 1, verse 2 uses a feminine verb form to say that the Spirit of God hovers over the waters. Connection. Why you see this as a significant step to the support of your thesis. The gender of a noun in Hebrew, the gender of a verb in Hebrew, matches the gender of the person doing the action. This is significant. To further develop the connection, explain why it is significant, you might say, this is our first introduction, or one of our first introductions to the person of God. It sets the tone. And if you go further into the biblical text, you will see that the verb to hover is something only a mother bird does. And the verb is used significantly in that way by the prophet Isaiah. Someone might object and say, are you sure that that verse, Genesis chapter 1, verse 2, is really a verse about God? Because it speaks of the Spirit of God. And perhaps you would respond that both Jewish and Christian tradition have considered the Spirit of God as integral to God's existence. There's a great deal more to say. This is just an example. Here's an example of an argument that uses a dream as evidence. Your thesis, God exists. Your evidence for this? You once had a dream of a beautiful eagle. You woke from that dream feeling uplifted and certain of the existence of a higher power. And yet, this might seem subjective. So you articulate the principle that makes you argue from your subjective experience to a thesis about God. You understand that God appears in dreams in symbolic forms. You develop that further by appealing to a scholarly perspective that develops your principle. And you say, we don't know what God looks like. But existential psychologists say that dreams of great emotional power are dreams of God. And in those dreams, God looks and feels and sounds like things important to us. God appears in dreams through symbols important to us. And somebody might ask significantly, importantly, isn't this all purely subjective way of knowing God? And perhaps you would respond to the objection by saying, God is only known to us through our subjective consciousness. That is all we have. Again, there's a great deal more to say, but it is simply an example. Here's an example of using stories as evidence. Your thesis. Mythical stories told across generations have great spiritual power. Your evidence? Well, you interviewed many people, and every single person you interviewed told you how a mythical story gave them spiritual guidance in a time of challenge. What is your connection? How are you generalizing from that bunch of individual stories to your thesis, your more general thesis? Because you understand that personalizing communally held mythical stories is one way that people live into spirituality. That's what you have understood from the evidence That's what makes it add up for you. But of course, spirituality has many different kinds of definitions, and you will have to explain your definition of spirituality so that others can really understand the connection you've articulated. Perhaps you would say, spirituality involves stepping out of your ego concerns into something larger. And when you move between your own life story and stories held by a multi-generational community, you step into something larger that overflows your individual life and yet is also a part of you. And someone still might ask you, how do you know that these stories are spiritual in the sense of truly about God? And you might respond by saying, we trust the wisdom of our elders, and we trust the power of community to discern what is true. And when you skillfully develop an argument, you too step into a multi-generational tradition of scholars. Multi-generalizable, but also multi-generational. You become part of the community that discerns what is true. That is what you are doing as a researcher. And I hope that you will find it a satisfying and eye-opening spiritual experience of growth. Thank you.